We moved into Cypress Ridge for peace after 15 years of chasing cartels, arms dealers, and corrupt politicians across continents. My wife, Commander Rachel Graves, finally took the Bureau's offer to transfer into stateside operations. A quieter post, a steadier life, a home where she could sleep without boots by the bed and a Glock under the pillow, so we bought a brick colonial at the end of a cul-de-sac, trees lining the road like sentries, a duck pond nearby, and just enough distance from the DC noise. It was supposed to be perfect, until Karen happened. It started innocently enough. A yellow HOA violation slip tucked under the windshield of Rachel's government-issued SUV. The bold, fluorescent notice was stamped with immediate attention. Required. Rachel stared at it, sweat still clinging to her jawline from the 6-hour tactical debrief she'd just finished. She hadn't even made it past the foyer before stepping out again to retrieve her badge from the glove compartment. Found the slip fluttering on the windshield like a threat. The violation: overnight street packing, vehicle deemed tactical in nature. Rachel blinked. What does that even mean? I joined her at the curb. It means we're on their radar. That's when we saw her stepping out from behind a hedge like she was making a grand entrance, clipboard in hand, lips pursed like she'd sucked on lemons since birth, and a smugness so thick you could butter toast with it. Good evening, she chirped, stepping into our driveway like she owned it. I'm Karen Moffat. I head the HOA Compliance Committee. Rachel, still in boots and tactical pants, raised an eyebrow. You gave my vehicle a ticket. Karen gave a tight, toothless smile. It's not a ticket, it's a notice. Cypress Ridge policy: no military or federal vehicles may be parked on residential streets overnight. We pride ourselves on aesthetic harmony. Rachel didn't flinch. This SUV isn't military. It's FBI, registered and cleared. Parked legally in front of my house. Karen tilted her head like a schoolteacher correcting a child. Doesn't matter. It's intimidating. People have complained. I wanted to laugh. This woman had no idea who she was talking to. Rachel said nothing. She just held Karen's gaze until the clipboard lowered slightly, like even Karen sensed something she couldn't explain. Then Rachel turned, walked into the house, and quietly shut the door behind her. Karen stood outside for another minute, trying to process the fact that her power trip had just stalled. That should have been the end. But it was only the beginning. Over the next week, the violations kept coming, each more ridiculous than the last. One morning it was inappropriate mailbox height, then non-regulation trash bin color. Karen even cited us for the unapproved texture of Rachel's front door welcome mat. It became clear this wasn't about rules. It was personal. Neighbors kept their heads down. A few offered sympathetic glances. One guy whispered, "You're not the first she's targeted, but you might be the last." His voice trembled like he was afraid she'd hear through the hedges. Rachel remained composed, calm, watching. One morning the doorbell rang. Todd Corrin stood there, flanked by 2 board members, holding a printed copy of the HOA manual. "We need to discuss your ongoing non-compliance," she said, flipping to a highlighted paragraph about vehicle types deemed disturbing to neighborhood ambience. Rachel took the paper, read the line, and looked up. "You've made your point," she said softly. "Now leave my property." Karen blinked. "Excuse me." Rachel stepped forward. Her tone didn't rise, but it thickened like reinforced steel. "You've made your power play. You think a clipboard gives you control. I'm telling you, for the last time, this ends now." Karen laughed nervously. "Are you threatening me?" "No," Rachel said, "but if you keep pushing, you'll learn what real authority looks like." Karen huffed, turned, and stormed off, tripping slightly on our non-compliant welcome mat. I closed the door behind them and looked at Rachel. "You going to call in a complaint?" She didn't answer. Instead, she sat down at the kitchen table, opened her laptop, and began typing. Not a complaint, a case file. By the 3rd week, Rachel had catalogued 15 violation slips, each one more absurd than the last. Karen was relentless. If the SUV wasn't in the driveway by 8 p.m., a yellow slip appeared. If Rachel's boots left a trace of red clay on the porch, Karen snapped photos. Even our Halloween decorations drew a citation for being excessively macabre. Rachel didn't retaliate. She documented every slip, was scanned and filed. Every HOA regulation cross-referenced and bookmarked. She stayed quiet, observing Karen like she would a suspect in a federal sting. But Karen mistook silence for surrender. One Thursday morning, I returned from the grocery store to find Rachel sitting on the front steps, face unreadable. Her SUV was gone. "I parked out front for 10 minutes while grabbing a report," she said. 10 minutes. I looked down the street. No vehicle in sight. She towed it. Worse, she called the cops. The words chilled the air. According to the responding officer, whom Rachel had calmly debriefed, Karen claimed that there was an armed federal vehicle parked illegally and a suspicious woman in tactical gear loitering near school property. Loitering. Rachel had been standing in our front yard with a manila file in one hand and a coffee in the other. The officer had arrived with lights flashing and a hand near his holster, only to be greeted by Rachel's federal ID and an unimpressed stare. "I thought you'd pull rank," I said, still processing it. "She's not worth my badge," Rachel replied, "but she's escalating." Rachel nodded slowly. Then so will I. That afternoon, we received a formal letter from the HOA board signed by Karen, naturally. It was a final warning regarding non-compliance. Attached were photos of Rachel's SUV, blurry surveillance shots of her unloading groceries, and a printed timeline of her offenses. The bold headline read, "Recurring disruption of neighborhood harmony." I expected Rachel to tear it in half. Instead, she placed it gently atop the file she'd been building. "She's drawing lines she doesn't understand," she said. "But she's made one thing clear: this is no longer about policy." That night, we attended our first HOA meeting held in the community clubhouse. The room buzzed with nervous energy. Folding chairs creaked beneath silent neighbors, some avoiding eye contact, others whispering behind cupped hands. Karen sat at the head of the long plastic table like a queen on a plastic throne. When we walked in, the murmurs stopped. Karen cleared her throat. "Glad you could finally join us." Rachel didn't sit. She simply pulled a folder from her bag and placed it on the table with deliberate calm. "I'd like to make a public record of formal harassment." Karen's smile faltered. Rachel continued, voice measured but resolute. "This folder contains every violation issued against our property since we moved in, most of which are either fabricated or enforced arbitrarily." Karen scoffed. "Are you seriously accusing this board of harassment because you don't want to follow the rules?" Rachel's tone didn't waver. "I've spent 2 decades enforcing federal law. I know the difference between rules and power plays." A ripple ran through the crowd. Karen leaned forward, eyes narrowed. "You think that badge makes you special?" "No," Rachel said, "but it means I know how to file a civil suit. And if this continues, I will." Karen stood abruptly. "This meeting is adjourned." "Not yet," came a voice from the back. It was Mr. Donnelly, a soft-spoken retiree who usually kept to himself. "I've been fined 3 times this year for wind chimes." "Wind chimes? You're not keeping the peace, Karen, you're weaponizing it." A few heads nodded. Karen's lips thinned, but she said nothing. Rachel didn't need applause. She gathered her file, nodded respectfully to the board, and walked out. The silence behind her said more than any speech ever could. We got home just before midnight. The SUV was back in the driveway, returned by the same officer who towed it earlier that morning, now apologetic and visibly embarrassed. Before bed, Rachel received a call. It wasn't from the police. It was from a federal liaison, apparently. Karen had attempted to file a formal complaint with the local field office claiming Rachel was impersonating a federal agent. I looked at her as she hung up. "What now?" Rachel didn't smile. She opened her laptop, clicked into a secure portal, and began drafting a new document. This one had an official header: Preliminary Review, Civilian Interference with Federal Personnel. By the time the federal review process was underway, Karen had begun unraveling. The same woman who once marched the sidewalks like a suburban warden now avoided direct eye contact. But fear didn't stop her, it only made her more erratic. Overnight, new rules began appearing on the HOA website, announced amendments targeting law enforcement presence, non-residential vehicle activity, and even overly assertive behavior at meetings. Rachel, of course, fit each line item with surgical precision. Karen wasn't hiding her war anymore. She was institutionalizing it. Rachel, however, remained composed. She didn't argue. She didn't retaliate in public. She let Karen dig deeper while she built her case. What Karen failed to realize was that the FBI's Internal Affairs Department had already assigned an investigator to the situation. What began as a small complaint was now part of a broader review of civilian interference in federal affairs. A few calls from Rachel's direct reports, combined with Karen's reckless attempt to file a false impersonation claim, had accelerated everything. And then came the break. One afternoon, as I returned from walking the dog, I saw Rachel on the porch with a young woman in plain clothes. They shook hands and exchanged a folder. I recognized the badge clipped to her belt. When I stepped inside, Rachel closed the door and turned to me with a look I hadn't seen since her active field days. "It's worse than I thought," she said. "Karen's been forging fines." I blinked. What? Half the citations we received were never approved by the HOA board. She created a secondary login to the HOA database, filed them herself, then signed off using fake board member credentials. She handed me a page-an audit trail, every fabricated violation traced to Karen's IP address. "And that's not all," Rachel added. "Turns out she tried to pressure one of the junior board members into signing off on a retroactive policy, banning government vehicles." "Intimidation?" I asked. Rachel nodded. "On record." The next morning, a formal cease and desist letter from the Bureau was delivered to Karen's address by a federal courier. It was brief, precise, and impossible to ignore. Karen had 48 hours to halt all action against Rachel or face legal consequences for impersonation, obstruction, and harassment of a federal officer. She didn't respond. Instead, she tried to double down. That evening, Rachel's SUV was towed again. But this time it wasn't a city-registered tow service. It was a private company, unlicensed, operating without a permit. According to the officer who responded, the tow had been ordered using a falsified HOA authorization form complied to with Karen's signature. Karen had officially crossed into criminal territory the next day. Rachel met with the HOA board time, not as a resident, but as a federal officer. The meeting was called an emergency session. The clubhouse was packed. Whispers buzzed from every corner of the room as Rachel stepped forward. Composed and unreadable in her dark blazer, she laid a single folder on the table. Inside, a printed chain of Karen's unauthorized policy edits of the forged login credentials, the impersonation complaint she filed with the field, office testimonies from 3 board members, and the kicker, the private tow company's invoice and signed affidavit confirming Karen as the requester. Karen, seated at the far end, went pale. Rachel didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to let the record reflect. She said that this board has been misled, weaponized, and compromised by one individual acting without authority. I am prepared to file federal charges, but I'm offering the board a choice to act first. The room was dead silent. It was Mr. Donnelly who finally stood. I move to suspend Karen Moffat from all HOA duties, effective immediately, pending legal review. The vote wasn't close. 8 hands raised. 1 abstained. Karen stood slowly, her lips trembling. You can't do this. You don't get to take this from me. Rachel's voice was ice. You did that yourself. Karen stormed out, knocking over a chair on her way. No one followed her. As the crowd filtered out, neighbors approached us with quiet apologies, whispered thanks. One mother slipped Rachel a note. Thank you for standing up to her. We were too afraid. Rachel nodded but said little. Her mind was already on what came next. That night, the phone rang. The FBI's Office of Professional Responsibility. The case had been reviewed. Karen's actions now qualified for federal charges, including falsifying reports, impersonating HOA authority in conjunction with government enforcement, and misuse of local law enforcement to target federal personnel. Looked at Rachel. Are you going to press it? Her answer was simple. She made this war. I'm just ending it. The morning of the hearing arrived like a final storm. Clouds loomed low over Cypress Ridge as Rachel buttoned her blazer, clipped her badge to a belt, and grabbed the thick case file she'd built over weeks of restraint, documentation, and strategic silence. She wasn't just showing up to protect her name anymore. She was representing every neighbor who had suffered in silence under Karen's reign of pettiness and fear. The HOA clubhouse had never been so full. Local news vans were parked out front. Neighbors packed the folding chairs, shoulder to shoulder, whispering nervously as the room buzzed with anticipation. Karen sat alone at the front, her one-sprout clipboard now replaced with trembling hands and heavy eye bags that betrayed sleepless nights. At 9 a.m. sharp, the HOA president, who had previously remained passive, banged the gavel. We're here to formally address allegations of misconduct and criminal interference by board member Karen Moffat, as well as to acknowledge the involvement of federal authorities in the investigation. Rachel rose. She placed the folder on the table and began calmly. Over the past 6 weeks, this HOA has been manipulated by a single individual who weaponized her position to harass, intimidate, and endanger residents, most notably a federal officer operating within the bounds of her constitutional and professional authority. Gasps echoed through the room. Karen stood abruptly. This is a witch hunt. I was protecting this neighborhood from intimidation. Intimidation? Rachel interrupted, her voice low but unshakable. You filed a false report to local law enforcement. You ordered unauthorized tows. You impersonated board consensus and fabricated citations. You falsified a complaint to the FBI's own Internal Affairs Division. That's not enforcement, Karen. That's a criminal offense. Karen's voice cracked. I didn't know who you were. That's exactly the problem, Rachel said, stepping forward. You didn't care. A representative from the FBI's legal division stood next. He read aloud the formal charges recommended by the Department of Justice: criminal impersonation, obstruction, harassment of federal personnel, misuse of emergency services, and unauthorized access to community databases. The room sat in stunned silence as the weight of it all landed. Karen tried to speak again, but her voice barely rose above a whisper. This was never supposed to go that far. Rachel looked at her, gaze steady. That's what happens when you mistake control for leadership. Within the hour, the board voted unanimously to permanently remove Karen from her position. A restraining order was issued on the spot, barring her from contacting any board members or setting foot on HOA property beyond her own lot line. But that wasn't the end. Within days, the federal investigation went public. Karen's name hit regional news. HOA residents across the state started sharing stories from previous neighborhoods where she'd served on boards and pulled similar stunts. A pattern emerged. The FBI quietly widened the net. Her house went up for sale within the week. On her final day, neighbors watched through blinds as Karen loaded boxes into a dented hatchback. No moving van in sight. She didn't say goodbye. She didn't make eye contact. Rachel didn't watch from the window. She didn't need to. She had other plans. A month later, the vacant lot next to ours transformed into something new: a community outreach hub, funded partially by the Bureau's public engagement program and run by Rachel herself. The center offered seminars on civic rights, law enforcement transparency, and conflict resolution. Neighbors who had once avoided each other now gathered over coffee and policy handbooks. One Saturday, Mr. Donnelly, The retired veteran with the wind chimes approached Rachel with a cup of black coffee in hand. Never thought I'd see the day we weren't walking on eggshells. Rachel smiled gently. All it takes is one person who isn't afraid to say, "No more," he chuckled. Guess that person turned out to be you. She shook her head. No, that person lives in every neighborhood, on every block. I just had the right tools to fight back. And she had, with patience, with evidence, with the law, not with noise, not with threats, but with strength. By the end of that year, Cypress Ridge was no longer known for its strict HOA. It was known for the woman who brought accountability back to the co-d-sac. Karen had underestimated Rachel Graves. She saw a quiet woman in boots and a badge. She didn't see the years of command, the steady hands that had overseen joint task forces, the eyes that had stared down global threats without blinking. She didn't see the FBI commander, but everyone else does now, and no one parks in front of our house without waving first.